Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 311, Henri III. Once Catherine had composed herself after the death of Charles IX, she dispatched a messenger, Henri, presently in Poland, telling him to turn around. He was now the King of France. She expressly warned her son not to delay coming back at all. She recognized that any delay would create an opening for anyone, likely her youngest son, to attempt a coup. Interestingly enough, she also sent instructions to the Poles themselves, whom she had paid a hefty sum and which she didn't want to get up. She suggested that the Poles accept either her younger son or, maybe elect someone new who could be supervised by a French commissioner. Now, both of these were awkward requests, to say the least, given that the Poles had not elected her youngest son to anything, and there was absolutely no precedent in any monarchy anywhere in Europe of a commissioner from another country being in charge of your king. Now, from the Polish perspective, they were fine that Henri was going home. Didn't have an issue with that. He hadn't fit in particularly well. But they did like the prestige and power that a connection to a continental superpower like France brought. They were loath to give that up. So some negotiations were clearly necessary. Henri and Navarre and the Duke of Alençon, the youngest son of Catherine de' Medici, were quick to ratify Catherine's position as regent in Henri's absence. She next moved to purchase a peace with the Huguenots in La Rochelle at a price tag of 70,000 livres. When Henri got back to France, then he could decide how to deal with these rebels. But for the moment, Catherine determined that France needed peace. The news of his ascension reached Henri in Poland on June 15th. When the news of Charles's death became public, it caused a lot of consternation in Krakow. Henri, calm and self-possessed, announced that a Polish Diet had to be called for September, and that he would hand the government of France over to the Queen Mother, while the Polish Assembly deliberated on how best to proceed. Poland's interest had to come first, Henri reassured everyone. France was, after all, in his mother's safe and experienced hands. He appeared remarkably serene, and though the less trusting nobles determined to keep a close eye on him, it was generally believed that he was going to behave honorably throughout all of this. However, beneath this false veneer of calm and patience, Henri and his advisors were actually making frantic plans for their escape. They determined that the time for this was the night of June 18th, only 3 days after the news of Charles's death had arrived. After nearly botching his escape attempt, and that's really what it was, several times in the days leading up to it, Henri and his entourage managed to get out of Krakow in the dead of night on the 18th of June. It wasn't long before the absence of the king and much of the Polish crown jewels was discovered, however. Almost immediately, a troop of Tartar cavalry flew in an attempt to recapture the fleeing monarch. And at least according to our sources, the Tartars nearly got them. In fact, Henri barely escaped over the Vistula River in time, reaching the safety of Silesia moments before the cavalry got him. From there, Henri traveled in disguise until he reached Vienna. There he received a warm welcome from Emperor Maximilian II. While in Vienna, Henri wrote to Catherine, assuring her that he had safely made his escape. The emperor advised Henri to adopt a policy of religious toleration once back in France, as that had worked seemingly well for the empire. He also hoped that Henri might wed his widowed daughter, though Henri had different plans on that front, which he kept to himself. On July 11th, 1574, Henri reached the city of Venice, where he received a warm welcome. He spent 8 carefree days in Venice, reportedly the happiest of his life. From Venice, Henri traveled north until he reached Savoy. Now, at this point, he's getting almost daily correspondence from Catherine begging her son to hurry home as the political situation within the kingdom continued to deteriorate rapidly. Henry ignored her, staying 12 days in Savoy. Catherine then decided to take matters into her own hands, traveling to Lyon to meet with her son and almost literally drag him back to Paris. She took Alençon and Navarre with her just to be sure they didn't perpetuate any mischief while she was gone. Once Henri reached her, the two embraced and wept. He then declared France the greatest kingdom on earth and was overjoyed to be back. Then the entourage hurried on to Paris. Now, Catherine was 55 years old when her favorite son ascended the throne. Over the years, she had willingly adopted many of the numerous new innovations of modern Europe, including tobacco. However, Catherine remained staunchly traditional when it came to the monarchy. Her son was not a first among equals. He was an absolute monarch, plain and simple. Catherine would do everything she could to keep him in that position. Her passion and capacity for work remained even in her older years. And with the ascension of her youngest, but by far most confident son, I suppose the biggest question she faced was, would she still be able to dominate this new king? Unlike Charles IX at his ascension, Henri was a grown man. Now, there were also two competing aspects of her son's personality that deeply concerned the Queen Mother. On the one hand, he was a lover of excess and, frankly, borderline obsessed with his mistress. On the other hand, he was an extremely devout Catholic, for whom no sacrifice to an angry God was too great. While the court of the deceased Henri II was remarkably discreet by Renaissance standards, the new Henry III, spent his days surrounded by the splendor of his own creation. Now, in September, in fact, of 1574, the Spanish ambassador would later write back to Madrid that the French king spent all evening dancing and banqueting. Luckily for Catherine and France, Henri III was at least willingly, initially, to heed her advice. Many of her loyal and experienced ministers were kept on into the new reign. The king agreed with his mother that many secretaries of state had grown far too used to corresponding as they saw fit without first consulting the king. Hence, he decreed that he be shown all letters before any response was written and personally signed the final drafts. He was, for his later faults, a hard-working king. Henri also excluded, by and large, the two great families of the realm, the Guises and the Montmorencys, from major roles in his administration. For better or worse, he was determined to be his own man. Unfortunately, while Henri agreed with much of the political advice, he espoused a different view of how a monarch should handle himself, and brought back with him many of the habits that he had picked up in Poland that were designed to keep him away from his kingdom's people. Now, this didn't please the French people at all. He no longer took his meals surrounded by the public, but behind a low wall intended to keep the crowd from coming too close. When he ate, his gentlemen attended upon him rather than his servants. The king did permit certain individuals to approach him, but they had to ask permission first and follow a strict set of rules before engaging His Majesty in conversation. Dinner, or lunch as we would say, was taken around 11 o'clock in the morning, and a more elaborate supper in the evening, later followed by a ball or some sort of other entertainment. Meal times were no longer the milling of courtiers around the person of the king while he ate. Unlike his predecessors, Henri didn't want to live as publicly, believing that overfamiliarity was just the way that people got insolent with the king. It offended his royal dignity to be surrounded by his most senior courtiers while he stood undressed, and he ordered that from now on, no one could enter his chamber until he was clothed. Such reforms, as simple as they seem to us today, actually provoked a rather angry response. But Henri stuck to them at least as long as he could. Although, when some nobles protested by leaving court, he was forced to relax or give up many of them, at least for the time being. In 1585, the king would print a booklet of precise instructions on court etiquette. This actually served as the foundation for fantastically stylized manners, customs, and rituals that would later dictate court life at the Palace of Versailles under the famed Louis XIV. But of course, as usual, the biggest issue that Henri or any French king was facing during this time period wasn't court etiquette. It was the succession. For all his libertine values, he didn't have any children. Hence, rumors increased exponentially as to his ability to produce said children now that he was king. And likewise, of course, religious turmoil continued. The province of Languedoc was the major Protestant stronghold at this point, and royalist efforts to bring the rebels there to heel were proving fruitless. It helped that Huguenot leaders had effectively tied the idea of religious reform to the idea of political and economic reform as well. It just made it easier to sell to the people. Many Huguenots were demanding that the king call the Estates General to deal with the taxation issue amongst others. France's finances remained a mess. They really had been since Henri II, Catherine's husband. Charles had raised taxes on just about everything during his reign, and now it seems like the population just wasn't willing to tolerate such a high level of taxation any longer. Again, I think there's a lot of ways that mid-16th century France looks a lot like France on the eve of the Revolution in the 18th century. Now, making matters worse, Henri's beloved mistress died not long after his ascension, effectively paralyzing the king with grief. But before we see how Henri deals with all this, we need to shift gears big time and bring a few major developments in England back up to speed. In 1575, England saw a dramatic improvement in the financial condition of the kingdom. Trade was restored with the Low Countries. Spain was on friendlier terms once more. In April, Henri III offered to extend the Treaty of Mutual Protection, known as the Treaty of Blois. Elizabeth immediately accepted. Walsingham's spies had finally infiltrated Mary Stuart's household, and the world seemed at peace for once. On May 17, 1575, Matthew Parker, Elizabeth's first and most tolerant Archbishop of Canterbury, died. This was, of course, an incredibly important position in the Church of England. In considering his replacement, Cecil made one of the biggest mistakes of his career by nominating Edmund Grindal. Grindal turned out to be an incredibly strict Puritan whose prophesizings were, in the opinion of the Queen, both seditious and subversive. His faults were not immediately apparent upon his appointment, but would become a matter of grave concern over the next 2 years. Elizabeth's relationship with Grindal rapidly deteriorated in 1576, when she ordered him to suppress puritanical practices of worship, which she considered to be outside or beyond the pale of the Anglican Church, and he refused, which should come as no surprise as he was, a Puritan. The Puritans, by the way, aren't a major force in England, not yet, not during Elizabeth's reign. But certainly, their rise is a factor that we're going to have to bear in mind as the 16th century slowly comes to an end. We'll be talking about them quite a lot in the 17th century. Now, essentially, the deadlock between the Queen and the Archbishop was broken in 1577, when Elizabeth simply placed Grindal under house arrest. As the head of Church of England, she could do that, and ordered all bishops to suppress Puritan worship herself, which again, as head of the Church of England, she could do that. Grindal, in the end, only kept his position and probably his head because Dudley intervened on his behalf. Back in the spring of 1576, Elizabeth finally let the fiction, that she might marry the Duke of Alençon die. He's now going to be known as the Duke of Anjou, by the way. This gets a little bit confusing, but just know that Catherine de' Medici's youngest son takes over the title of Duke of Anjou after Henri becomes the king. Now, during the early months of 1577, Walsingham's spies, now an effective force, gradually exposed a Catholic conspiracy that was masterminded by Don John of Austria, who, assisted by the ever-present Duke of Guise, was plotting to invade England with 10,000 troops, depose Elizabeth, and then return the kingdom to the Catholic fold. The plan was that Don John would then marry Mary Stuart and rule jointly with her. Walsingham, of course, urged the Queen to take punitive measures against Mary, but once again she refused. She did, however, knight Walsingham for his years of service to the state. Now, fortunately for England, Don John was far too preoccupied with affairs in the Netherlands to put his plans into effect. Now, there's an aspect to Elizabethan history that I have not mentioned at all, but is certainly worth knowing about, and that is, of course, discovery. The Elizabethan age was one age of discovery when it seemed like European knowledge of the world grew exponentially day by day. Spain, as we know, had by now explored and colonized large swaths of the Americas. Portugal had done the same in Africa and now in Brazil. Now, new markets also meant new opportunities for pirates, and this is truly when we're starting to get into the golden age of piracy. The most famous of these, or maybe infamous, and there were several, of course, was Sir Francis Drake. Drake, on May the 24th, 1572, had sailed from Plymouth to the New World, his purpose being to exact retribution from the Spaniards, who had attacked and harried his ships during earlier voyages. 15 months later, he returned from the Americas with a massive hoard of treasure looted from Spanish ships. This was not the first time English privateers had seized Spanish treasure, but it was the greatest haul by far. News of Drake's booty and his colorful adventures soon reached the Queen, who was jubilant at the thought of how maddened King Philip would be by such blatant piracy, and fascinated by Drake's exploits. Overnight, the man became famous throughout England and notorious in Spain, where he was called El Draki, the Dragon. Naturally, Spanish envoys complained to Elizabeth, but while she was vaguely conciliatory or pretended to be concerned, she did absolutely nothing to stop these acts of piracy. And indeed, she benefited from them, since much of the looted treasure went directly into the English coffers. At the end of 1577, Francis Drake set off in his ship, the Pelican, on what was to be an epic world voyage. His priority, however, was not exploration, but once again, to bother the Spaniards, who had retaliated for his seizure of their treasure by attacking English ships. There was a great deal of public interest in the venture, and Walsingham arranged for Drake to be presented to the Queen before he left. According to our records, she greeted him as follows, quote, "Drake, so it is that I would be revenged on the King of Spain for the divers injuries I have received," end quote. Drake answered that the most effective way to do this would be to prey on Philip's ships and settlements in the Indies, with which Elizabeth wholeheartedly agreed. But it wasn't all parties and pirates in the late 1570s. In March 1578, the most recent Scottish regent lost power, and James IV became the King of Scotland in his own name. Just before then, in January 1578, news came that the Protestant Dutch armies had suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of Don John of Austria, which gave Elizabeth cause to point out to Dudley that she had been right all along about not wanting to involve England in a war it might lose. Instead, she now hoped to use her diplomatic influence with Philip II to bring about a settlement that was not only acceptable to both sides, but also to English interests. Thanks to the provocation given to King Philip by English privateers and the help supplied to the Dutch by Elizabeth, the peace with Spain was on a precarious footing, to say the least, and fears were expressed that Philip might yet invoke the Pope's interdict and make the rumored enterprise of England, that is, the invasion of England, become a reality. Making matters worse, it was just when the Duke of Anjou, now again this is Catherine de' Medici's youngest son, raised a soon-to-be fruitless plan to invade the Netherlands with French troops, which was the very, very last thing that Elizabeth wanted. Now, it was under these circumstances that Elizabeth began to consider marriage again to Anjou, the youngest son of Catherine de' Medici. In fact, his messenger brought a formal marriage treaty to the Queen in March 1579, but there was still the issue of religion, and this divided Elizabeth's council as they debated the treaty. Sure, Anjou seemed happy to convert for Elizabeth's sake right now, but, at this point, he was the heir to the throne of France, and therefore required to remain a Catholic. Plus, Elizabeth was 45 and too old under the standards of the age to even consider having children. But in the end, it didn't matter. The Privy Council rejected so many French terms that Anjou could not possibly have accepted the treaty, a fact that Elizabeth certainly knew. True to her policy, however, she continued to string the French and Anjou along, insisting she might still consider the match, despite her counsel, if only Anjou came to England. So desperate, in fact, was Anjou that he sailed for Greenwich that August. According to all our reports, the two got along quite well despite the age difference, and for perhaps, maybe the only time in her reign, it looked as though Elizabeth might not be forever the Virgin Queen. Yet this was, of course, a state and not a personal matter. It had always been. And the reality was that the people of England were dead set against a match with France, at least at this point. In September, a Norfolk gentleman and Puritan, John Stubbs, wrote a pamphlet with what's got to be the longest title in the history of the universe. And it's this whole thing. The discovery of a gaping gulf whereby England is like to be swallowed by another French marriage, if the Lord forbid it not bans letting her majesty see the sin and punishment thereof. That's the title of the pamphlet. It didn't sell very well. The pamphlet was printed, though, and published in London. It was widely distributed throughout England and did influence public opinion to a large extent. Elizabeth was furious beyond belief when she read the pamphlet. Later that same month, she issued a formal statement condemning it, while at the same time reminding her people that she would never change her religion for marriage. Parliament was due to debate the marriage treaty on October the 20th, but Elizabeth postponed the matter 1 month so that she could discuss it further with her council. What followed were a series of the most heated debates of her reign. Dudley and his faction opposed the marriage. Cecil and his cadre were in favor. Matters went back and forth for weeks with no resolution. Yet, in her heart, Elizabeth knew she could not accept the marriage treaty and keep the love of her subjects. She would never give up the latter, so she had to reject the former. Still, in order to keep the French on her side, Elizabeth was determined to string along the negotiations as long as possible, a sport that she was now quite accomplished in. In late November, she agreed to sign the marriage contract with the proviso that the formal treaty would need to be ratified by Parliament, and she knew there was no chance of that. This would allow her the ability to say no without actually doing so. In the words of the Archbishop of York, quote, "The French matter was dashed," end quote. They just didn't know it yet. Now, next week in our episode, we stick with England, because things are finally going to come to a head with Mary Stuart, and she finally loses hers.